We are not wasting our time on your pathetic little promotion ceremony, my parents told me. But when the morning newspaper showed me at the Pentagon with two armed bodyguards, my mother panicked and called a family meeting. I showed up, and I brought a surprise that destroyed their entire fake empire. My name is Carmen. I am 34 years old, and for my entire life I was the family punching bag. Before I tell you how I brought down my golden child brother and his entitled wife, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family. The heavy leather bill folder hit my chest before sliding off and landing on the pristine white linen tablecloth right next to my half-eaten filet mignon. I looked up slowly. My mother Patricia was glaring at me from across the massive table, her diamond earrings catching the light of the crystal chandeliers hanging above us. "You need to handle your own portion, Carmen," she announced, her voice loud enough to make the neighboring tables turn and stare. "Julian rented this exclusive table for the family, but since you contribute absolutely nothing to our legacy, you can pay for your own plate." I sat quietly in the upscale Washington steakhouse, taking in the ridiculous scene in front of me. To my left sat my father, Richard, swirling a glass of imported scotch that cost more than my first car. Across from me was my older brother, Julian, the undisputed golden child of the family, casually adjusting the cuffs of his custom-tailored suit. Beside him sat his wife, Brooke. She smoothed her blonde hair and gave me that familiar, condescending smile she had perfected since marrying into my African-American family and deciding she was suddenly high society. "Julian is celebrating a major financial milestone tonight," Brooke chimed in, her tone dripping with a sickly sweet fake sympathy. "He just closed another massive real estate acquisition for his investment fund. We simply cannot expect him to subsidize someone who refuses to apply herself and expects handouts." "You understand, right, Carmen?" I looked down at my simple charcoal blazer. It was highly professional, perfectly tailored, and strictly conservative, exactly what my security clearance required. But to them, it was undeniable proof of my supposed poverty. Actually, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and refusing to break eye contact, "I have a major milestone to celebrate tonight as well. I just received a massive promotion at work." My father slammed his scotch glass down on the wooden table, making the expensive silverware rattle against the plates. "We are not wasting our time on your pathetic little promotion ceremony," Richard scoffed, his face twisting in genuine disgust. "Working as some low-level government desk jockey and collecting a pathetic taxpayer paycheck is absolutely nothing to celebrate. Look at your brother. He is a chief executive officer. He builds real empires. You just push paper around a cubicle all day. What is there to be proud of?" Brooke let out a sharp little laugh and leaned forward, resting her chin on her manicured hand. "Oh, let her have her little moment, Richard," she sneered, her eyes raking over my outfit. "Maybe her fancy new clerk title means she can finally afford a handbag that does not come from the clearance rack at a discount outlet. It must be so incredibly exhausting pretending you belong in elegant places like this when you are clearly struggling." Her words were meticulously designed to humiliate me, but they only ignited a cold, familiar clarity deep in my chest. This was exactly how they had always operated. 10 years ago, when I received my acceptance letter to a prestigious master program, I went to the bank to withdraw from the college fund my late grandparents had set up for me. The teller informed me the account was completely empty. My parents had legally drained every single cent of my tuition money. When I confronted them, Patricia did not shed a single tear or show an ounce of remorse. She coldly told me that Julian needed the cash to buy a Porsche as a startup gift to impress his new wealthy investors. They literally stole my entire future to fund his inflated ego, leaving me to take out crushing student loans and work 3 grueling night jobs just to keep a roof over my head. They built his illusion of success by completely sacrificing my reality. I did not yell. I did not cry. I simply reached into my conservative jacket pocket and pulled out a solid metal exclusive black card issued only to top-tier federal executives. I placed it directly on top of the leather bill folder and slid it toward the waiter who had been hovering awkwardly nearby. "Put the entire table on this," I instructed the waiter calmly. "Include a very generous gratuity for your excellent service." Julian frowned, staring hard at the heavy metal card. "What kind of credit card is that?" he asked, his voice suddenly losing a fraction of its arrogant edge. "Just a perk of pushing paper," I replied, standing up from the table and smoothing my blazer. I grabbed my coat and looked down at the four of them, feeling absolutely nothing but pity. "Enjoy the rest of your evening. I have early executive meetings." I did not wait for their response. I turned my back on their shocked, speechless faces and walked out of the restaurant, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. As I stepped out into the crisp evening air, waiting for the valet to bring my car, my phone buzzed heavily in my pocket. I pulled it out and opened the encrypted messaging application. The screen glowed bright with a secure message from my superior at the Department of Defense. "Clearance fully granted." Director, the message read, "Your newly appointed forensic team is assembled and awaiting your direct orders. Your next target is the Vanguard Investment Fund." I read the name of Julian Company on my screen, and a slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. They thought I was a pathetic government clerk struggling to survive. They had absolutely no idea that I had just been officially sworn in as the Senior Forensic Financial Intelligence Director at the Pentagon. And my very first official mission was to completely tear down the fraudulent empire my golden child brother had built on stolen money. The very next morning, my phone buzzed with an urgent text from Patricia demanding I immediately drive out to Great Falls, Virginia, to help Brooke with her charity gala preparations. I honestly would have ignored her under normal circumstances, but the Pentagon directive from last night echoed clearly in my mind. Vanguard Investment Fund was my official target now, and Julian's $4 million mansion was the physical headquarters of his fraudulent empire. I desperately needed a look inside that house. I drove my unassuming sedan up the long winding driveway, pulling up next to Julian's absurdly flashy sports cars. The front doors were massive custom iron and glass reflecting the morning sun. Before I could even knock, the door swung open to reveal Brooke holding a clipboard and looking completely frazzled. She was wearing a silk morning robe that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "Oh, good. You are here," Brooke sighed, thrusting a heavy box of fabric swatches into my arms before I even stepped fully into the foyer. "Take these to the formal dining room. Carmen, the event planner, is running late, and I need someone to organize the centerpieces by color gradient right now." I stood there holding the heavy box while she turned her back on me, tapping away on her phone. She did not say hello. She did not offer me a glass of water after my long drive. She simply expected me to play the role of her unpaid assistant, just like she always did. I swallowed my pride, reminding myself of the federal badge sitting heavy in my inner pocket. I walked into the massive dining room and started sorting the expensive silk samples on the long mahogany table. My mother, Patricia, strolled into the room a few minutes later, holding a crystal glass of sparkling water. She looked me up and down with that familiar look of deep disappointment that I had endured my entire life. "You really wore that cheap gray suit to your brother's beautiful home?" Patricia sneered, shaking her head in disgust. "You could at least try to look presentable around Brooke. She comes from a good family, and she is used to a certain high standard of living." I kept my face perfectly blank as I sorted the pale pink fabrics, refusing to give her the emotional reaction she craved. Brooke wandered back into the room and immediately chimed in. "It is fine," Patricia Brooke said with a condescending little laugh. "Not everyone understands how to dress for success. Though, Carmen, your hair is looking a bit unruly today. You know Julian has an amazing stylist downtown who specializes in managing difficult textures. I could give you her card if you ever want to look a bit more polished for your office job." The casual microaggression was so typical of Brooke. She loved finding polite ways to remind me that my blackness and my basic existence were somehow offensive to her delicate sensibilities. Patricia actually nodded in enthusiastic agreement. "You should take her advice," Carmen, Patricia added, tapping her manicured fingernails against her crystal glass. "Remember when Julian first started Vanguard? Your father and I made sure he had the absolute best custom Italian suits because image is everything in the business world. We gladly took out a second mortgage on our own home just to make sure your brother looked like a chief executive. You could learn a lot from him instead of settling for mediocrity in your little government cubicle. Before I could formulate a response, the heavy wooden doors of the home office swung open and Julian marched into the dining room. He was practically vibrating with arrogant energy. His custom suit was perfectly pressed, and he wore a smug grin that made my stomach turn. "Crack open the vintage champagne," Julian announced loudly, clapping his hands together. "Your husband just closed a $50 million government defense contract." Brooke shrieked with delight and threw her arms around his neck. Patricia actually gasped and rushed over to hug her golden boy, tears of joy springing to her eyes. My father, Richard, walked in right behind Julian, patting him heavily on the back. "A $50 million federal contract." Richard boomed, his voice echoing in the massive room. "That is my boy, building a generational empire, just like I always knew you would. You are carrying this entire family on your back, Julian." Julian smirked and looked over at me, standing quietly by the floral arrangements. He adjusted his expensive silk tie, mocking me with his eyes. "Hear that, little sister?" he asked, his voice dripping with arrogance. "50 million from the Department of Defense. The government trusts me with their biggest budgets while they probably pay you pennies to fetch coffee for middle management. Maybe if you ask nicely, I can hire you as a receptionist at Vanguard. You could finally quit that dead-end job and see what real wealth looks like." I just smiled tightly, my mind racing. The Department of Defense. He had just openly admitted to defrauding the exact federal branch that I was now directing. "That sounds like quite the achievement, Julian," I said, keeping my voice smooth and utterly devoid of emotion. "I am going to grab a glass of water from the kitchen to celebrate your big news." I slipped away from the sickening display of family worship and walked into the sprawling marble kitchen. The space was pristine except for a small stack of mail and documents tossed carelessly onto the center island. Julian always was sloppy with his paperwork, believing himself to be completely untouchable. I walked over to the sink, pouring a glass of water while my highly trained eyes scanned the documents on the counter. There was a highly confidential bank statement sitting right on top, bearing the Vanguard Investment Fund logo. I took a slow sip of water and stepped closer, committing every single digit to memory. The numbers did not match his grandiose boasts in the other room. The primary operating account was severely overdrawn. There were massive, frantic wire transfers moving back and forth between dummy shell companies just to cover basic interest payments. Vanguard was completely bleeding cash. The $50 million defense contract was just a phantom injection of stolen taxpayer funds desperately needed to keep his collapsing pyramid scheme afloat for one more month. My pulse quickened with pure professional adrenaline as I stared at the routing numbers. My golden child brother was not a financial genius building a generational empire. He was a desperate criminal drowning in a massive Ponzi scheme. And I was the one holding the match that was going to burn his entire fake world straight to the ground. The next morning, the sterile bright lights of the Pentagon felt a million miles away from the ridiculous crystal chandeliers of my brother's mansion. I swiped my high-security clearance badge, letting the heavy reinforced steel door slide open to reveal my tactical operations center. I am not an administrative paper pusher. I am the Senior Forensic Financial Intelligence Director for the Department of Defense. My specific job is to track down, trace, and obliterate massive corporate fraud against the United States government. 20 elite federal agents sat at their respective workstations running complex financial algorithms and tracking millions of dollars across global networks. As I walked down the center aisle toward my glass-enclosed corner office, the entire room buzzed with focused, intense energy. "Good morning, Director," my lead field agent Marcus announced, handing me a thick manila folder labeled Strictly Confidential. "We finally cracked the primary shell company structure on the Vanguard investigation." My heart hammered fiercely against my ribs, but my professional exterior remained absolutely perfectly calm. "Lay it out for me, Marcus," I instructed, dropping my briefcase onto my polished mahogany desk. Marcus opened the file, spreading out heavily redacted bank statements and complex wire transfer diagrams across my desk. Our initial forensic audit indicates a massive, systematic siphoning of federal defense funds, he explained, pointing to a series of offshore accounts. The $50 million contract Vanguard secured yesterday was just the latest in a string of highly inflated government payouts. But here is the critical part, Director. The Vanguard Investment Fund is not actually building the military housing units they were contracted for. They are completely fabricating the construction invoices and funneling the taxpayer money straight into a private luxury real estate portfolio. I leaned over the desk, staring at the complex web of financial deceit. My own brother, the Golden Boy, the pride of the entire family, was running a massive illegal Ponzi scheme using federal dollars. He was literally stealing from the military to fund his sports cars, his custom suits, and Brooke's ridiculous diamond collections. He was not a brilliant businessman. He was a reckless, arrogant criminal, and he was about to face the full devastating weight of the federal government. But Julian is careless, I noted, tapping a pen against the fraudulent bank statements. He cannot sustain a massive scheme like this without heavily leveraged domestic loans. Who is quietly backing the initial Vanguard capital? Who is physically signing off on the massive collateral required to keep these dummy shell companies afloat? Marcus hesitated for a fraction of a second, an uncomfortable look crossing his usually stoic face. He pulled a separate, heavily sealed document from the bottom of the stack and slid it slowly across my desk. "That is the most disturbing part of the financial audit, Director," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "We pulled the primary guarantor reports for the initial $30 million domestic loan that Vanguard secured to launch the original shell company. The primary applicant is Julian, but he did not have the verifiable assets to secure the loan himself. He completely leveraged two private co-signers." I opened the sealed document and scanned the official bank signatures at the bottom of the page. The air in my lungs turned completely to ice. Staring back at me in black ink were two very familiar signatures, Richard and Patricia, my parents. My hands actually shook as I read through the detailed financial disclosures attached to the loan application. They had not just co-signed a simple business loan. My parents had legally signed over the deed to their massive family estate. They had fully liquidated their entire joint retirement pension. They had even secretly drained the emergency medical funds they had spent 30 years building. Richard and Patricia had literally mortgaged their entire existence, their past, their present, and their future, to financially back a massive federal crime. They had willingly handed over every single cent they possessed to fund Julian's fraudulent empire. Marcus watched me carefully, sensing the sudden tension in the room. "The co-signers are fully legally liable, Director," he stated quietly. "If Vanguard defaults, or if the federal government seizes the primary assets due to criminal fraud, those two individuals will lose absolutely everything. The bank will immediately foreclose on their primary residence and seize any remaining liquidated assets. They will be left completely destitute." I closed the folder slowly, the heavy weight of the revelation settling over me like a thick, suffocating blanket. My parents had willingly destroyed my entire future, stealing my college tuition just to buy Julian a car. And now they had willingly destroyed their own future just to fund his criminal illusion of success. They worshipped him so blindly they never even bothered to look at the paperwork they were signing. "Prepare the final asset freeze orders for the Vanguard accounts," I instructed Marcus. My voice completely steady, devoid of any emotional hesitation. "I want every single cent locked down tight by the end of the week. Do not let a single dollar leave those accounts." "Yes." Director Marcus nodded, gathering the documents. "What about the two co-signers? Do we initiate the asset seizure protocols for their properties as well?" I looked out the window of my office, watching the busy Pentagon courtyard below. The little girl who had spent her entire life begging for her parents' approval was completely gone. The woman who remained was a federal director sworn to protect the law. "Initiate the full protocol," I replied coldly. If they willingly signed their names to a federal crime, they will face the absolute consequences of their blind devotion. The drive to my parents' house in Fairfield took just under 40 minutes, but my mind raced the entire way. I gripped the steering wheel of my sedan thinking about the heavily sealed Pentagon documents sitting locked in my office safe. The forensic evidence was absolutely undeniable. Julian had weaponized our parents' blind trust, using their pristine credit and their fully paid-off family estate to secure the fraudulent capital for Vanguard. I knew exactly what was going to happen next. When the Department of Justice dropped the hammer, every single asset tied to Vanguard would be immediately seized. The bank would foreclose on the house I grew up in. My parents would be left with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs. Despite everything they had done to me, despite stealing my college fund and treating me like dirt for my entire life, a small, lingering piece of daughterly duty compelled me to give them one final warning. I pulled into the familiar circular driveway, taking a deep breath before walking up the brick steps and pushing open the heavy mahogany front door. I found my parents in the formal living room. They were sitting comfortably on the expensive leather sofas, sipping coffee and flipping through glossy brochures for luxury European river cruises. They barely looked up when I walked into the room. Richard and Patricia always acted as if my presence was a minor inconvenience, interrupting their otherwise perfect day. I stood in the center of the hand-woven Persian rug, trying to find the right words to save them from their own golden child. "Mom, Dad, we need to talk about Vanguard." I started keeping my voice deliberately soft and non-confrontational. "I know Julian asked you to sign some guarantor documents for his initial business loans recently. I just want to know if you actually read the terms of what you signed. Did you have an independent lawyer look at the liability clauses before you put your house up as collateral?" The temperature in the room plummeted instantly. My mother lowered her cruise brochure, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. "What exactly are you implying?" Carmen Patricia asked, her voice dripping with sudden hostility. "I am not implying anything, Mom," I replied, taking a careful step forward. "I am trying to protect you. Julian is taking massive financial risks right now. The commercial real estate market is incredibly volatile, and if Vanguard cannot meet its monthly interest obligations, the bank will legally come after the co-signers. You and Dad could lose this house. You could lose your entire retirement pension. You need to call the bank tomorrow and see if there is any way to quietly withdraw your names as primary guarantors before it is too late." Patricia stood up so fast her coffee cup rattled loudly against the glass table. She marched across the Persian rug until she was standing inches from my face, trembling with absolute rage. "How dare you?" She hissed, her eyes wide with a terrifying manic loyalty. "How dare you walk into this house and try to poison us against your own brother? Julian is a financial genius. He just secured a $50 million government contract while you are still pushing worthless paperwork for a miserable salary. He is building a legacy for this family, and all you can do is try to drag him down to your pathetic level." "Mom, you do not understand." I pleaded desperately, abandoning my usual stoic professionalism. "Those government contracts are not what they seem. The numbers do not add up. He is using your entire life savings to patch holes in a sinking ship. Please just listen to me for 1 minute." The sharp crack of her hand striking my face echoed through the large living room. The physical force of the slap snapped my head to the side, leaving my left cheek burning with intense, stinging heat. I stumbled backward, touching my face in pure shock. My mother stood over me, her chest heaving, her hand still raised in the air. "You are nothing but a jealous, bitter failure," Patricia screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You have always been insanely jealous of Julian's wealth and his success. You cannot stand the fact that he is a millionaire while you have absolutely nothing. You are trying to sabotage him because you are a miserable, empty person. I should have known you would try something this desperate and pathetic." My father Richard threw his cruise brochure onto the table and stormed over to join her. He did not ask if I was okay. He did not reprimand my mother for hitting me. Instead, his face was twisted into a mask of pure disgust. "I have heard enough of this garbage," Richard bellowed, pointing a thick finger at the front door. "You are not going to stand in my house and slander the only child who actually makes us proud." Richard did not wait for me to leave. He stomped past me down the hallway, heading straight for the hall closet, where I still stored a few boxes of my heavy winter coats and old luggage because my small apartment lacked storage space. I watched in stunned silence as my father violently yanked my suitcases out of the closet. He dragged them down the hardwood hallway, the plastic wheels scratching the expensive polish. He kicked the front door open and literally threw my luggage out onto the concrete front porch. One of the suitcases burst open, spilling my winter sweaters all over the dusty driveway. "Get your trash out of my house!" Richard shouted, standing in the doorway like a towering guard protecting his castle from an invader. "If you ever dare to speak ill of your brother again, I will permanently disown you, Carmen. You will be dead to this family. Do not come back here until you are ready to get on your knees and apologize to Julian for your disgusting jealousy. Now get off my property before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." The heavy mahogany door slammed shut with a deafening thud. The lock clicked securely from the inside. I stood alone on the front porch, the cold afternoon wind cutting through my thin blazer. My cheek still throbbed with a dull burning ache from where my mother had struck me. I slowly walked down the brick steps and crouched on the concrete driveway, gathering my scattered sweaters and shoving them back into the broken suitcase. My hands were not shaking anymore. The lingering daughterly guilt that had brought me here, the desperate desire to save them from their own terrible choices, completely vanished into the cold wind. They had made their choice. They had chosen the golden boy and his fraudulent millions over their own daughter who tried to save them. I zipped up the broken luggage and loaded it into the trunk of my car. I wiped the lingering sting from my cheek, taking one last look at the sprawling multi-million-dollar house that would soon belong to the federal government. I opened my car door, slid into the driver's seat, and pulled out my highly secure government-issued phone. The line connected directly to the Department of Justice Task Force Command Center in under 2 seconds. "This is Director Carmen," I said, my voice completely stripped of any remaining empathy or hesitation. "Initiate the absolute freeze order on all Vanguard Investment Fund assets immediately. Target domestic accounts, international offshore holdings, and all associated private equity." And agent, I added, staring coldly at the front door of my parents' house, "I need you to update the primary arrest warrants. Add Richard and Patricia to the official list of indirect co-conspirators. Freeze their pensions, freeze their bank accounts, and put a federal lien on their estate. Take everything." The enormous ballroom of the downtown Washington Plaza Hotel was dripping with the kind of excessive wealth that only comes from stealing other people's money. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over hundreds of high society guests who had no idea they were attending a celebration funded entirely by a criminal enterprise. It had been exactly 3 days since my father threw my luggage out onto his driveway and threatened to disown me for trying to warn them about Julian's inevitable downfall. 3 days since I sat in my car, wiped the sting of my mother's slap from my cheek, and made the official call to the Department of Justice to silently freeze every single asset associated with the Vanguard Investment Fund, including my parents' heavily leveraged estate. Tonight, I walked through the gilded double doors of my brother's charity gala, wearing a simple but incredibly elegant black evening gown. It was completely different from my usual conservative Pentagon suits, because tonight I was strictly undercover. Underneath the dark silk fabric, I was wearing a highly encrypted federal recording wire and a microscopic camera pinned discreetly to my lapel. My elite tactical team from the Department of Defense was already stationed around the perimeter of the building, posing seamlessly as valet drivers, security guards, and catering staff. We were waiting for one specific moment to tear down this beautiful illusion. I blended perfectly into the crowd of wealthy investors and corrupt politicians, keeping to the shadows near an extravagant ice sculpture that was carved to look like the Vanguard logo. Across the room, I could see my parents. Patricia and Richard playing the role of the perfect supportive family. They were laughing brightly and clinking champagne glasses, completely oblivious to the fact that their bank accounts were already secretly frozen by the federal government. They thought they were untouchable because of Julian. They had absolutely no idea that the luxury estate they returned to every night was already stamped with a federal lien. I watched my father pat my brother on the back with deep, overwhelming pride. Julian was wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo that probably cost more than the entire catering budget. He was working the room, shaking hands and projecting the flawless illusion of a brilliant chief executive officer. I was carefully analyzing his interactions with a group of shady corporate lobbyists when a sharp, piercing voice cut through the soft jazz music playing in the background. "What on earth are you doing here, Carmen?" the voice demanded. I turned slowly to see Brooke marching toward me, her face twisted in a mixture of shock and utter disdain. She was wearing a blindingly bright silver designer gown, holding a large crystal glass of deep red wine. Brooke stopped right in front of me, looking me up and down as if I was a disgusting stain on the polished marble floor. "Did you honestly think you could just crash my husband's exclusive charity gala?" She sneered, her voice loud enough to make several nearby guests turn and stare at us. I kept my face perfectly blank, refusing to break my undercover composure. "I am just here to observe the event." "Brooke," I said evenly, my voice steady and professional, "I suggest you lower your voice before you cause a scene." Brooke let out a loud, mocking laugh that echoed in the quiet corner of the ballroom. "'Cause a scene?" she repeated, stepping dangerously close to me, her eyes flashing with pure malice. "You are the one causing a scene just by being here. Your father threw you out of the house like the garbage you are, and now you show up here begging for attention." She raised her glass of wine, gesturing wildly as she spoke. "You are so pathetic and desperate, Carmen, always trying to ruin Julian's big moments, because you are nothing but a jealous little clerk who cannot afford to belong in elegant places like this." Before I could even take a step back, Brooke intentionally tilted her hand forward. The dark red wine splashed directly onto the front of my black silk dress, staining the expensive fabric instantly. "Oops," Brooke gasped loudly, covering her mouth with a manicured hand in a sickening display of fake shock. "My goodness, Carmen, you are just so incredibly clumsy. You practically bumped right into my glass. Maybe if you were used to attending high-class events, you would know how to navigate a crowded room without making a total fool of yourself." Several wealthy guests nearby let out soft, cruel laughs, whispering to each other and pointing at my ruined dress. Brooke smiled triumphantly, waiting for me to run out of the room in tears, just like she always made me do when we were younger. But I did not cry, and I did not run. I stood there feeling the cold wine soaking into my dress, and I just smiled. It was a slow, cold, dangerous smile that completely unsettled her. The smug satisfaction on Brooke's face slowly began to melt away, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion and rising panic. She had expected me to shatter under the weight of public humiliation, but she was looking at a federal director who held the absolute power to destroy her entire existence. "You missed Brooke," I said softly, my voice barely a whisper, but laced with lethal, unwavering authority. "Enjoy the rest of your night while it lasts." I turned my back on her, leaving her standing there completely speechless, and walked calmly toward the edge of the stage. The music suddenly faded out, and the crowd quieted down as Julian stepped up to the microphone. He looked out over the sea of wealthy elites basking in their blind adoration. "Thank you all for coming tonight," Julian announced, his voice booming through the speakers with unearned arrogance. "Vanguard Investment Fund has always been about building a stronger future for this great nation. We are doing incredible work and securing massive defense contracts that will change the landscape of our military infrastructure forever." The crowd clapped politely, and my parents beamed from the front row, looking at him like he was a god. But tonight, Julian continued, raising his hands for silence. "Tonight is about recognizing the visionary partners who make this possible. I would like to invite my newest primary investor to the stage, Mr. Marcus Vance. My heart hammered in my chest. Marcus Vance was the exact target my tactical team had been hunting for months. He was a notoriously corrupt defense contractor, known for laundering tens of millions of federal taxpayer dollars through illegal offshore accounts. Vance walked onto the stage, a slick, greasy smile on his face, holding a massive novelty check made out to the Vanguard Investment Fund for $10 million. Julian shook his hand vigorously, turning to face the flashing cameras of the society photographers. They stood there side by side, two arrogant criminals openly exchanging laundered federal money in front of hundreds of witnesses. I did not even blink as I adjusted the angle of my body, ensuring the hidden microscopic camera on my lapel captured every single high-resolution frame of the illegal transaction. I caught the firm handshake, I caught the exchange of the fraudulent check, and I caught the clear, undeniable proof of their federal conspiracy. I reached into my small clutch purse and pulled out my encrypted federal device. I quickly attached the secure image files and typed a direct message to the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. "We have the smoking gun." I typed, my thumbs flying across the digital keyboard. "Spring the trap." I hit send, slipped the phone back into my purse, and watched the stage with cold, absolute satisfaction, knowing that in exactly 60 seconds, the gilded doors of the ballroom were going to burst wide open, and my golden child brother was going to leave his own party in federal handcuffs. Exactly 60 seconds later, the heavy brass handles of the double doors turned, and the room exploded into absolute chaos. Federal agents in dark windbreakers poured into the ballroom, spreading out in a synchronized tactical formation. The soft jazz music was abruptly cut off, replaced by the sharp commanding shouts of the FBI, ordering everyone to freeze and keep their hands where they could be seen. The wealthy elites who had just been sipping expensive champagne froze in sheer terror. Julian stood on the stage completely paralyzed, still holding that massive, fraudulent $10 million check. The greasy, arrogant smile vanished from his face as two federal agents rushed the podium, grabbing his arms and forcing them roughly behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs echoed loudly through the suddenly silent room. I watched from the shadows, my face perfectly blank, as my golden child brother was read his rights and dragged off the stage like a common street criminal. Brooke let out a piercing theatrical scream, dropping her wineglass onto the marble floor, where it shattered into 100 pieces. My parents, Patricia and Richard, lunged toward the stage, shouting at the agents, demanding they let their innocent son go immediately. They threatened to sue everyone in the room, entirely unaware that they were screaming at the federal government. I simply turned on my heel and slipped out the side exit into the cool night air. My part in the physical takedown was officially over. Exactly 7 days passed since the charity gala raid. It was a quiet, crisp Tuesday morning. I sat at the small granite island in my modest apartment, holding a warm mug of black coffee. The silence of my kitchen was a stark contrast to the absolute financial hurricane I had unleashed upon my family. I opened my laptop and pulled up the digital edition of the Washington Post. The embargo on the investigation had officially been lifted at 6 in the morning. I stared at the screen, feeling a deep, profound sense of closure. Plastered across the front page in massive, bold print was the headline I had spent months working toward. Youngest Pentagon Financial Intelligence Director busts billion-dollar laundering ring. The story detailed the entire fraudulent network, exposing Vanguard for the massive Ponzi scheme it truly was. But it was the photograph directly beneath the headline that truly captured my attention. It was a high-resolution shot taken just yesterday outside the Department of Defense. I was walking down the iconic concrete steps of the Pentagon, wearing a sharp, tailored navy suit, my federal clearance badge clearly visible on my lapel. My face was set in a mask of pure, relentless authority, and I was flanked on either side by two massive, heavily armed tactical bodyguards. I looked powerful. I looked absolutely untouchable. I did not look anything like the awkward, pathetic little sister my family had spent 30 years mocking and belittling. As I sat there admiring the article, my personal cell phone began to vibrate violently against the granite countertop. The buzzing was frantic and relentless. I glanced down at the glowing screen. 52 missed calls from Patricia, 28 from Richard, 40 missed calls and 70 desperate text messages from Brooke. They had obviously seen the morning paper. The carefully constructed delusion they had lived in for years was entirely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. They finally understood exactly who I was. They finally realized that the daughter they had thrown out into the cold driveway just days ago was the senior federal director who held their entire existence in the palm of her hand. The phone lit up again, vibrating loudly. Patricia was calling for the 53rd time. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, watching the screen flash. I felt absolutely no desire to answer. I let it ring until the call went to voicemail. A few seconds later, the little notification icon popped up on my screen. I tapped the icon and set the phone on speaker, placing it carefully next to my coffee mug. Patricia's voice filled my quiet kitchen, and the sound of it sent a cold shiver of absolute triumph down my spine. The arrogant, dismissive tone she had used to control and humiliate me my entire life was completely gone. There was no condescension. There was no mocking cruelty. Instead, her voice was trembling, fragile, and laced with pure, unadulterated terror. "Carmen, please pick up," she begged, her voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate sob. "Carmen, you have to answer the phone right now, please." Her breathing was ragged and panicked. "The police are at Julian's office downtown right now. Federal agents and windbreakers are carrying out boxes of his files. They are taking everything, Carmen. They are loading his computers into dark vans. We just saw the morning paper. We saw the article about you on the front page. We had absolutely no idea you were a federal director. We thought you just worked a small dead-end desk job. You have to talk to us." Brooke is entirely hysterical and your father is pacing a hole in the floor. "There is an emergency family meeting tomorrow morning at our house. You have to come. You are the only one who understands this government stuff. You have to use your position at the Pentagon to save your brother. Please, Carmen, you are his sister, and you have to fix this before he goes to prison." I listened to the voicemail play out, feeling a hollow, ringing silence fill the kitchen when it ended. For 30 years, they had treated my very existence as an embarrassment. They had openly worshipped a criminal while treating an honest, hard-working daughter like the dirt beneath their expensive shoes. My mother had literally slapped me across the face for daring to suggest that her perfect son was anything less than a business god. My father had thrown my winter coats onto the concrete and threatened to disown me permanently. They had laughed at me, mocked my clothes, insulted my career, and mortgaged their entire future to fund Julian's luxury lifestyle. And now they were begging me to save them. They genuinely believed that family loyalty could somehow override a federal criminal indictment. They actually thought I could just wave a magic wand at the Department of Justice and make all of Julian's massive financial crimes magically disappear. I looked back at the front page of the Washington Post, staring at my own face on the screen. I had spent my entire life trying to earn a seat at their table, trying to prove that I was worthy of their love and their respect. But staring at that article, I realized I never needed a seat at their table because I had built my own. I deleted the voicemail and finished my coffee. Tomorrow morning, I would go to their little family meeting, but I was not going there to save my brother. I was going there to watch his fraudulent empire burn to the ground. 2 hours after listening to my mother's pathetic voicemail in my kitchen, I swiped my high-level security badge at the heavy, reinforced steel doors of my tactical command center inside the Pentagon. The room was bathed in the cool blue light of dozens of massive monitor screens, tracking the real-time financial destruction of the Vanguard Investment Fund. My lead agent Marcus walked up to me immediately holding a digital tablet with a grim expression. "Good morning, Director," he said. His eyes locked on the scrolling data. The initial raid on Julian's downtown office was completely successful. The FBI secured all physical servers and the hard drives just as you predicted. We are currently executing the global freeze order on all known Vanguard domestic accounts and his personal assets. I walked slowly down the center aisle of the command center, watching my elite team of forensic accountants dismantle my brother's entire criminal existence line by line. The air buzzed with the quiet hum of computer processors and the rapid clicking of keyboards. On the primary wall monitor, a giant digital map of Julian's financial network flashed red as each domestic account was locked down. I stared at the screen, feeling a deep, profound sense of satisfaction. For years, Julian had built his entire identity on the illusion of limitless wealth. And now I was stripping it away stroke by stroke. "How much have we locked down so far, Marcus?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of any familial attachment. Marcus tapped his screen, reviewing the live feed of the federal seizures. "We have successfully frozen exactly $42 million in domestic funds," he reported. "We also placed the federal liens on your parents' estate and all 3 of Julian's luxury vehicles just as you ordered. They cannot move a single cent without triggering a Department of Justice alert." But right as Marcus finished his sentence, a loud, piercing siren began to blare from the terminal of a junior agent sitting in the front row. The screen on her monitor flashed with a massive yellow warning banner casting a bright glare across her face. "Director, we have a massive breach attempt," the agent shouted over the noise of the alarm. "The primary target is trying to initiate a high-priority wire transfer." I walked quickly over to the agent's desk, staring down at the rapidly scrolling numbers on her monitor. Julian was cornered and desperate. The FBI had raided his office, but he was still technically a free man until the grand jury officially indicted him. He was obviously sitting in a panic somewhere, hiding behind his fancy, high-priced lawyers and trying to salvage whatever he could before the walls completely caved in. "Where is he trying to send the money?" I asked, my eyes tracking the digital routing numbers bouncing across the dark screen. The agent pulled up the destination code, her fingers moving frantically. "He is attempting to route $10 million through a shell company directly into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands," she explained. "He is trying to bypass the domestic freeze by using a secondary biometric authorization from a hidden shadow account." My brother was arrogant, but he was not entirely stupid. He had clearly kept an emergency stash of stolen defense funds hidden in an unregistered account preparing for the day. His massive Ponzi scheme finally collapsed. He actually thought he could just wire $10 million out of the country, flee the jurisdiction, and live out the rest of his life drinking expensive cocktails on a tropical beach while our parents lost their home and went bankrupt paying for his crimes. He truly believed he was smarter than the federal government. He believed he was smarter than me. Not on my watch. "Step aside, Agent," I said, pulling up a rolling chair and sitting directly in front of the primary terminal. I cracked my knuckles and placed my hands over the keyboard. The system showed the transfer progress bar steadily climbing across the screen. 10%, 20%, 30%. He was seconds away from moving the money completely out of federal reach and escaping justice. I did not hesitate. I immediately bypassed the standard interagency protocol and accessed the highest level of administrative override granted exclusively to my director clearance. I typed in a rapid sequence of encrypted commands tracing the exact digital pathway Julian was using to push the money offshore. I could almost picture him sitting in a dark room sweating through his expensive tailored suit, gripping his phone, and praying for the offshore transaction to complete. The progress bar hit 80%. The transfer was almost finished. I entered my final personal authorization code and slammed my finger down on the Enter key. The screen froze for a fraction of a second before the progress bar completely vanished. A solid green box appeared on the monitor, displaying 2 simple words: "Transaction terminated." I watched as the federal system automatically seized the hidden $10 million, ripping it directly out of his shadow account and pulling it securely into a highly restricted federal holding vault. The account balance on the screen dropped from $10 million to exactly zero. The entire command center fell completely silent. The loud blaring alarm shut off, leaving only the soft mechanical hum of the servers. Marcus stood behind me, staring at the screen in absolute awe. "We got it all, Director," he said, his voice full of quiet, profound respect. "Julian is completely wiped out. He does not have enough money left to buy a cup of coffee. His entire network is gone." I pushed my chair back from the terminal and stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my navy blazer. My parents had begged me on that frantic voicemail to use my position to save their precious golden boy. They had demanded that I step in and fix the terrible mess he had created. They were about to learn a very hard lesson about accountability and consequence. I reached into the pocket of my suit and pulled out my personal cell phone. The screen was still cluttered with dozens of unread, panic-stricken messages from my mother, my father, and my sister-in-law, Brooke. Brooke had texted me repeatedly, complaining that her black credit cards were declining at the luxury boutiques downtown. My mother was begging for a lifeline. They still thought they could manipulate me, bully me, or guilt me into doing exactly what they wanted, just like they always did. I unlocked the phone and opened the main family group chat. My fingers were completely steady as I typed out my response. The days of crying over their rejection were permanently over. The woman who needed their validation was dead. I hit send and placed the phone back into my pocket, walking away from the monitors. The message delivered instantly to their phones read simply, "I will be at the meeting tomorrow. I have a surprise for everyone." The next morning, Julian's sprawling custom-built mansion was a war zone. The flawless aesthetic of their multi-million-dollar home was shattered by the sound of glass smashing against the imported Italian marble floors. Julian had barely slept a wink, pacing the length of his massive living room in a state of absolute manic panic. He was shaking uncontrollably, his expensive silk tie hanging loosely around his neck. He had spent the last 12 hours watching his billion-dollar Ponzi scheme evaporate into thin air, frantically dialing his offshore bankers and getting nothing but dead dial tones. Across the room, Brooke was completely hysterical, pacing like a caged animal. She had just returned from an emergency shopping spree at her favorite luxury boutiques, trying to soothe her nerves, but the outcome had only poured gasoline on the fire. She hurled a heavy crystal vase at Julian's head, missing him by inches. It shattered violently against the custom fireplace. "Every single one of my platinum cards declined," Julian Brooks screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. I was standing at the register holding $50,000 worth of designer bags, and the machine flashed declined. Do you have any idea how humiliated I was? My friends were right there watching me get treated like a common thief. "Where is the money, Julian? Where is all of our money?" Julian dragged his hands through his perfectly styled hair, his arrogant facade completely gone. "It is frozen, Brooke," he yelled back, his voice cracking with terror. "Every domestic account, every shell company, every offshore reserve I tried to wire yesterday, it is all gone. Carmen locked it all down. She completely destroyed me." My parents, Richard and Patricia, were sitting on the expensive velvet sofas, watching their golden boy's empire collapse in real time. But instead of holding Julian accountable, Patricia immediately stood up to comfort Brooke. Patricia had always worshipped Brooke. To my mother, Brooke was the ultimate status symbol, a wealthy, beautiful white daughter-in-law from a prominent family who elevated our own social standing. Patricia treated her like royalty, while constantly reminding me that I was a dark, plain disappointment who would never belong in their elite circles. "Oh, sweetheart, please do not cry," Patricia cooed, wrapping her arms around Brooke's, shaking shoulders and smoothing her blonde hair. "This is just a terrible misunderstanding. We are going to fix this right away." My father nodded vigorously, his face flushed with desperate denial. "Your mother is absolutely right, Brooke," Richard insisted, gripping his gold-handled cane, completely ignoring the fact that his own house was heavily leveraged and currently under federal lien. Carmen is just throwing a little temper tantrum because she felt left out of the family business. But we saw the morning paper. We know exactly how much power she has at the Pentagon now. She is a top director. She has the authority to make all of these federal charges completely vanish. Brooke sniffled, wiping her ruined mascara. You really think she will do that for us? Brooke asked, her voice dripping with venom. She hates us. She has always been insanely jealous of Julian's success. Patricia let out a cold, dismissive scoff, waving her hand in the air. It does not matter what she wants, Patricia said, her tone hardening with absolute entitlement. Carmen is family and she owes us. She will use her government position to clear Julian's name and unfreeze your bank accounts because we are going to make her do it. She is just a tool to get us out of this mess. When the meeting happens today, she will fall right back into line just like she always does. Miles away in the secure depths of my Pentagon office, I was not preparing to fall back into line. I stood completely still behind my heavy mahogany desk, the morning sunlight streaming through the reinforced bulletproof windows. The air in my office was perfectly quiet, a stark contrast to the absolute chaos I knew was happening at Julian's house. I walked over to the glass, looking out over the sprawling complex of the Department of Defense. My phone was still buzzing silently on my desk, lighting up with endless demands from my mother to hurry up and come to the house. They truly believed that blood and guilt were stronger than federal law. They thought they could just command me to erase Julian's massive conspiracy, the same way they used to order me to do his high school homework. I wore a dark gray tailored suit, my badge clipped securely to my lapel. I turned back and looked down at the smooth wooden surface of my desk. Resting right in the center was a thick, heavy manila dossier. The paper was dense and weighted with undeniable proof of every single financial crime my brother had committed over the last decade. Stamped violently across the front cover was a bright, blood-red seal from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Beneath the seal, in stark, bold black letters, were two words: arrest warrant. I slowly picked up the heavy dossier, feeling the weight of 30 years of family trauma and financial corruption resting in my hands. I did not feel an ounce of guilt or hesitation. I opened my sleek black leather briefcase, carefully placing the federal warrant inside. I snapped the brass locks shut, the sharp metallic click echoing in the quiet room. My family was waiting for me, expecting a frightened little girl who would blindly use her hard-earned power to clean up their criminal messes. They were expecting a savior. They were about to get a reckoning. The drive to my parents' sprawling estate in the wealthy suburbs was a route I had memorized over decades of obligation and anxiety. But today the winding tree-lined roads felt entirely different. Today I was not driving toward my childhood home as the forgotten, disappointing daughter, desperately hoping for a scrap of validation. I was driving as the architect of their absolute destruction. The heavy black leather briefcase rested on the passenger seat beside me, the brass locks gleaming in the morning sunlight. Inside it held the federal arrest warrant that was going to end my brother's entire existence. I pulled up to the massive wrought iron gates of the mansion and swiped my old access card. The heavy metal doors slowly swung open, granting me entrance into the gilded cage where I had spent my entire life being treated like a second-class citizen. I parked my car right in the center of the circular driveway, exactly where my father had thrown my luggage onto the concrete just days ago. I stepped out into the crisp air, feeling the weight of the moment settle over me. I was wearing a razor-sharp charcoal gray power suit tailored perfectly to project absolute, unyielding authority. The dark fabric contrasted sharply with the crisp white silk blouse beneath it, and my federal clearance badge was pinned visibly to my lapel. I grabbed the briefcase, feeling its satisfying weight, and walked up the wide stone steps to the heavy mahogany front doors. I did not bother knocking. I pushed the heavy handles and walked straight into the grand foyer. The atmosphere inside the house was thick with panic and suffocating tension. The remnants of yesterday's chaos were still visible. Pieces of shattered crystal from the vase Brooke had thrown were still scattered across the edge of the imported Italian rug. The moment my shoes clicked against the polished hardwood floor, The frantic murmuring in the living room came to an abrupt halt. I walked into the massive sunken living room and found my entire family gathered exactly as I had expected. My parents, Patricia and Richard, were huddled together on the expensive velvet sofa, looking exhausted and terrified. Brooke was pacing near the fireplace, clutching a half-empty glass of wine, even though it was barely 10 in the morning. And Julian, my perfect golden child brother, was standing in the center of the room looking like a trapped animal. He looked absolutely terrible. His usually flawless hair was disheveled. His eyes were bloodshot and dark circles bruised the skin beneath them. The moment he saw me walking through the archway, his posture stiffened. But instead of showing even an ounce of remorse or humility, Julian did what he always did. He immediately went on the offensive. He rushed across the room, closing the distance between us. His face twisted in a mask of furious, arrogant entitlement. "Where the hell have you been?" Julian demanded, his voice echoing loudly off the high, vaulted ceilings. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, completely ignoring the fact that his entire life was currently burning to the ground. "Do you have any idea what is happening right now, Carmen? My offices were raided by federal agents. They took everything. They froze my bank accounts and locked down my offshore routing numbers. Some federal agent intercepted a $10 million wire I tried to send to the Caymans yesterday and wiped my balance to zero. You need to get on the phone right now and fix this." I stopped walking and just stared at him. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I just let him continue his pathetic rant. "You work at the Pentagon," Julian ordered, stepping even closer, trying to use his height to intimidate me, the way he had done since we were teenagers. "You are a federal director now. You need to call whoever is in charge of this ridiculous witch hunt and tell them to back off immediately. Tell your superiors that Vanguard Investment Fund is a highly classified defense contractor, and this investigation is a massive mistake. You are going to pick up your phone, call your boss, and drop this entire investigation before they ruin my reputation." He was actually ordering me. He had stolen tens of millions of dollars, laundered federal taxpayer money, committed massive financial fraud, and his instinct was to treat me like an obedient secretary. My parents watched eagerly from the sofa, nodding along with his demands. They truly believed that I was just a convenient tool to be used to rescue their precious son. Before I could even open my mouth to respond, Brooke stepped out from behind Julian, crossing her arms over her expensive designer sweater. She looked me up and down with that familiar sneering disdain, still acting as if she held some kind of superior high ground. "Well, at least your stupid government job is finally useful to this family." Brooke spat, her voice dripping with venom and condescension. "My platinum cards are declining at boutiques all over the city, and it is completely humiliating. Make the call to your little federal friends before the press gets a hold of this and ruins our social standing. We do not have time for you to sit here and play dumb, Carmen. Just do what your brother says and fix it." The absolute delusion radiating from all of them was staggering. They were standing in the middle of a federal financial seizure, complaining about their social standing and ordering me to break the law. I kept my face perfectly neutral, holding the heavy black briefcase tightly by my side. I walked right past Julian, completely ignoring his presence, and moved toward the sitting area. There was a silver tea service resting on the low glass coffee table, probably left there by the housekeeper earlier that morning. I calmly set my briefcase down on the sofa, poured myself a delicate porcelain cup of steaming tea, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The warm liquid felt soothing against the cold anticipation building in my chest. The room was dead silent, watching me. They were waiting for me to pull out my phone and frantically dial my superiors to save them. They were waiting for the obedient little sister to do her job so they could go right back to ignoring my existence. I lowered the teacup, holding it gently in my hands, and looked up, meeting Julian's bloodshot eyes. My voice was quiet, but it carried a lethal, devastating weight that cut through the silence of the room like a physical blade. "No one can drop this investigation, Julian," I said smoothly, my tone completely devoid of any sympathy, "because the person leading it is me." The silence that followed my words was so absolute that I could actually hear the rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock out in the grand hallway. Julian stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, unable to process the reality of what I had just said. But it was my father who broke the silence. Richard's face transitioned from a pale, sickly white to a deep, violently angry shade of crimson. He took a step toward me and slammed his fist down so hard on the heavy glass coffee table that my porcelain teacup rattled against its saucer. "This is a complete lie," Richard roared, his voice echoing harshly through the massive living room. "You are lying, Carmen. You are playing some kind of sick, twisted joke on us because you have always been insanely jealous of your brother. You sit there in your cheap little suit and pretend you have some kind of ultimate authority over us, but it is a bluff. It is an absolute bluff." He paced back and forth, his chest heaving with indignant rage. He pointed his gold-handled cane at me, trembling with fury. "I demand that you stop this pathetic clown show right now," he shouted. "You are going to pick up your phone, call whoever is actually in charge of this ridiculous witch hunt, and you are going to do your duty to this family. Your brother is a brilliant financial mind. He is a vanguard of industry. You are nothing but a petty, bitter desk worker trying to punish him because you could never achieve a fraction of his success." Patricia immediately chimed in, stepping up to stand shoulder to shoulder with my father. "Your father is right, Carmen," she said, her voice dripping with venom and condescension. "You have always harbored this ugly, resentful jealousy toward Julian. Ever since you were children, you wanted what he had. And now you are trying to use this little government mix-up to scare us. Well, it is not going to work. We know exactly who you are." I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I simply reached down and clicked open the brass latches of my heavy black leather briefcase. I reached inside and slowly pulled out a stack of crisp official government documents. I took the first document, a thick stapled packet bearing the official seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and dropped it directly onto the glass coffee table right in front of Julian. It hit the glass with a heavy, definitive thud. "That is the official federal freeze order," I said, my voice perfectly calm and entirely devoid of emotion. "It contains the exact routing numbers of every single domestic and offshore account you tried to hide, Julian. It outlines the exact shell companies you used to launder taxpayer money. It details the $42 million we seized this morning and the $10 million you frantically tried to wire to the Caymans just 2 hours ago. Go ahead and read it. Read the signature of the primary authorizing director at the bottom of the final page." Julian stared at the document as if it were a venomous snake. His hands were visibly shaking as he slowly reached out and flipped to the last page. All the blood drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. His eyes widened and a horrible choked sound escaped his throat. The arrogant, untouchable golden boy was completely gone, replaced by a broken, terrified criminal who suddenly realized there was no way out. But I was not finished. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a second document. This one was a single piece of paper, a highly classified forensic accounting receipt. Julian's eyes darted to the paper and he lunged forward, trying to snatch it out of my hand, but I was faster. I smoothly slid the paper across the smooth glass table directly toward Brooke. "What is this?" Brooke demanded, looking down at the paper with narrow, suspicious eyes. That I explained, taking another slow sip of my tea is irrefutable proof of where your husband's company funds have actually been going. It is a certified purchase receipt from a highly exclusive diamond jeweler in Switzerland. Julian used exactly $100,000 of stolen investment capital to purchase a custom, flawless diamond necklace. Brooke let out a sharp, victorious laugh, crossing her arms and looking down her nose at me. "So what?" she sneered. "My husband buys me expensive jewelry all the time. That just proves he is incredibly successful and knows how to treat his wife. You are just proving how pathetic and jealous you really are, Carmen." I smiled for the very first time since entering the mansion. It was a cold, calculated smile. "Look closer at the shipping address, Brooke," I suggested softly. Brooke's smug expression faltered. She picked up the piece of paper, her manicured nails gripping the edges tightly. She read the description of the $100,000 diamond necklace, and then her eyes slowly tracked down to the delivery address printed at the bottom of the receipt. It was an address for a luxury penthouse apartment downtown. An apartment that definitely did not belong to her. She read the name listed on the delivery instructions. It was the name of a 24-year-old high-end real estate agent who Julian had supposedly been doing business with for the last 8 months. I watched as the color completely vanished from Brooke's face. Her skin turned a deathly, sickly pale and her perfectly painted lips parted in absolute silent horror. She looked up slowly, her eyes locking onto Julian, who was now sweating profusely and backing away toward the fireplace. He was stammering, trying to form words, but nothing coherent was coming out. "You bought a $100,000 diamond necklace for your mistress, Brooke," whispered her voice, trembling with a mixture of profound shock and rising violent anger. "While my credit cards are declining at the mall, while federal agents are raiding your office and ruining our lives, you were busy spending a fortune on that pathetic little blonde real estate agent." Julian raised his hands defensively, his voice cracking with desperation. "Brooke, please let me explain," he begged, taking a step toward her. "It is not what it looks like. That was just a corporate gift. It was a business expense to secure a new commercial property deal. You have to believe me." But Brooke was no longer listening. The villainous, arrogant alliance that had stood united against me just 5 minutes ago was now violently tearing itself apart from the inside. Brooke let out a piercing, ear-splitting scream of pure rage and lunged at Julian. She grabbed a heavy brass candlestick from the mantel and hurled it directly at his chest, screaming about how he had humiliated her, how he had ruined her life, and how she was going to destroy him. Patricia shrieked, trying to pull Brooke away while Richard desperately yelled for order, swinging his cane and demanding they stop acting like animals. I just sat back on the comfortable velvet sofa, crossed my legs, and watched their perfect, fraudulent empire burn to ashes right in front of my eyes. Brooke did not stop with the candlestick. She let out a feral, guttural shriek that tore through the pristine mansion and threw her entire body at my brother. Her manicured hands curled into vicious claws as she swung wildly at his face, catching his cheek and leaving bright red scratches across his perfectly tanned skin. Julian stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of the expensive Persian rug and crashing hard onto the polished marble floor. Brooke was immediately on top of him, screaming obscenities, pounding her fists against his chest and shoulders with relentless fury. All her fake high society elegance had completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but pure, unhinged rage. "You gave my money to some cheap blonde?" she shrieked, her voice hoarse and cracking with hysterical desperation. "You humiliated me. You stole from me. I will kill you, Julian. I will completely destroy you." My mother, Patricia, was absolutely frantic. She threw herself into the violent scuffle, desperately trying to wedge her body between her precious golden boy and his furious wife. "Get off him!" Patricia screamed, grabbing Brooke's designer sweater and hauling her backward with surprising, desperate strength. "Stop it, Brooke. You are acting like a lunatic. You are hurting him." Patricia shielded Julian as if he were a helpless toddler glaring at Brooke with absolute venom. Brooke shoved my mother away, breathing heavily, her hair completely ruined and her face streaked with tears and running mascara. "Do not touch me," Brooke spat, glaring at my mother with undisguised hatred. "Your perfect son is a fraud and a liar, and you are just as pathetic for defending him." Julian remained on the floor, his expensive, custom-tailored suit torn and crumpled. The arrogant, untouchable billionaire facade was entirely gone. He looked like a terrified, pathetic child who had finally been caught in a lie he could not charm his way out of. He scrambled onto his hands and knees, dragging himself across the cold marble floor until he was right in front of the sofa where I was calmly sitting. He reached out and grabbed the hem of my dark gray power suit, his hands shaking violently. "Carmen, please," he sobbed, his voice breaking into a pathetic, desperate whine. Tears were actively streaming down his bruised face. "Please, you have to stop this. You are my sister. We are family blood. You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood. I will pay it all back. I swear I will fix it. Just call off the FBI, please, Carmen. I am begging you, do not let them put me in prison. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity, no sibling loyalty, no remorse. For 30 years, this man had belittled me, mocked my career, and treated me like I was completely invisible. He had built an empire of lies, while our parents cheered him on. And now he was groveling at my feet, expecting me to save him from his own massive greed, using the very family ties he had always weaponized against me. I slowly reached down and pried his trembling fingers off my suit, brushing the fabric smooth with deliberate calm. I am not your savior, Julian, I said, my voice as cold as ice. You stopped being my brother the day you decided to build your life on stolen money and arrogance. Blood does not excuse federal crimes. I reached back into my heavy black leather briefcase and pulled out the third and final dossier. This one was the thickest of them all, bound tightly with federal secure tape and bearing the harsh stamps of forensic financial auditors. I tossed it onto the glass coffee table, letting it land right next to the receipt for his mistress's diamond necklace. It hit the glass with a loud, heavy thud that made Julian flinch and recoil. My parents and Brooke all froze, staring at the massive stack of papers as if it were a ticking bomb waiting to detonate. "What is that?" Patricia whispered, her voice trembling with rising dread. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and looked directly at my parents. "Do you remember calling me a failure at Christmas?" I asked, my tone razor-sharp and merciless. "Do you remember mocking my government salary and calling me a disappointment because I lived in a modest apartment and did not own a massive, sprawling mansion like this one?" My mother swallowed hard, refusing to meet my eyes, while my father leaned heavily on his cane. "Well," I continued, tapping the thick file, "you should probably read what your brilliant golden boy has been doing behind your backs for the last 3 years while you were busy bragging about his genius. Julian secretly mortgaged this exact house twice to patch the bleeding holes in his massive Ponzi scheme. He forged your signatures on the deeds and drained your entire retirement pensions completely dry. And Brooke, he emptied every single cent of your private trust fund and your personal savings accounts. He liquidated absolutely everything to keep his fraud afloat. It is all gone, every last penny." The words hit the room with the force of a devastating earthquake. Brooke let out a suffocated gasp, her hands flying to her mouth as she stumbled backward against the wall, sliding down until she hit the floor in a state of catatonic shock. Patricia let out a horrible, wailing sob, clutching her stomach, as the reality of her absolute financial ruin finally pierced her thick armor of delusion. She looked at the walls of the mansion, suddenly realizing they no longer belonged to her. But it was my father, Richard, who reacted the worst. His face turned a ghastly shade of gray, and his eyes widened in absolute sheer terror. The gold-handled cane slipped from his trembling grip and clattered loudly against the marble tiles. Richard clutched his chest, his breath coming in shallow, rapid wheezes, and collapsed heavily backward into his velvet armchair. His mouth hung open in silent horror as the devastating realization finally set in. Their perfect golden boy had not just made a mistake. He had burned their entire existence to ash. The absolute destruction of the Wilson family empire happened in deafening slow motion. Richard could not even speak, his hands gripping the armrests of his velvet chair so tightly his knuckles were stark white. He just stared at Julian with wide, unblinking eyes, his chest heaving as he gasped for air that seemed to have suddenly vanished from the room. His entire life, his legacy, his carefully hoarded wealth, his pristine reputation, it was all completely eradicated. Brooke was curled into a tight ball on the marble floor near the fireplace. She was rocking back and forth, weeping with a loud, ugly sound that echoed miserably across the high ceilings. Her hands were tangled in her expensive blonde hair, ruining the perfect styling she had spent hours on that morning. Every single dollar she had inherited, every cent she had saved to maintain her illusion of superiority, was gone, stolen by the man she thought was her golden ticket. She did not even look at Julian anymore. She just stared at the marble tiles, murmuring about her lost accounts and her ruined life. Julian was still on his knees, looking completely hollowed out. He was staring at the heavy federal file on the coffee table as if it were a physical executioner. He had nothing left to say. His charm, his arrogance, his manipulative lies had all run out. There was no one left to con, and no money left to steal. Then Patricia moved. My mother, who had spent her entire life parading her wealth and looking down on anyone she deemed unworthy, suddenly seemed to shrink. Her flawless posture collapsed. Her designer clothes suddenly looked ridiculous against the backdrop of her absolute ruin. She looked around the shattered living room, taking in her gasping husband, her weeping daughter-in-law, and her criminal son, and then her frantic, terrified eyes locked onto me. She saw the sharp tailoring of my suit, the federal badge on my lapel, and the absolute calm on my face. In her mind, I was no longer the disappointing daughter she had abused for 30 years. I was a federal director. I was power. I was money. I was her only remaining lifeline. Patricia let out a desperate, choking sob and fell heavily to her knees. She did not care about her ruined stockings or the sharp pieces of shattered crystal still littering the rug. She crawled across the floor, her hands scrambling frantically until she reached me. She lunged forward and desperately wrapped her arms around my legs, clutching the fabric of my tailored suit with a white-knuckled grip. "Carmen, please," Patricia sobbed hysterically, burying her tear-stained face against my knees. "Please, you have to help us. You cannot let this happen. You have to buy the house, Carmen. You have to pay off the mortgages before the bank takes it." I looked down at her, feeling a profound sense of detachment. The woman who had spent my entire childhood telling me I was ugly, stupid, and worthless was now weeping at my feet, begging for my money. "You are a director!" Patricia wailed, her voice cracking as she tilted her head up to look at me with desperate, pleading eyes. "You are rich now, Carmen. You have a high government clearance. You have the money to fix this. Julian made a mistake, but we are your family. We are your parents. You cannot just let us lose our home. You cannot just let us die on the streets like common beggars." Her tears were soaking into the fabric of my trousers. She was gripping my legs so tightly I could feel her fingernails digging into my skin. She was completely stripped of her pride, resorting to pathetic, animalistic begging to save her precious social standing. She actually thought that after a lifetime of cruelty, she could simply command me to sacrifice my own hard-earned wealth to bail out her fraudulent son. I stared down into my mother's terrified, weeping eyes. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel the lingering ache of the little girl who just wanted her mother to love her. I only felt absolute cold finality. I deliberately and forcefully stepped backward, pulling my leg out of her desperate grip. Patricia stumbled forward, her hands grasping at empty air as I created a physical boundary between us. "When I was starving and broken, you threw my bags into the dirt," I said, my voice echoing with a chilling, absolute authority. I looked around the room, making sure every single one of them heard my next words. "When I begged you for help to pay for college, you told me I was a waste of resources. When Julian stole my business idea, you celebrated his genius. You watched me suffer, and you laughed because you thought I would never be anything more than the family punching bag." Patricia reached out for me again, but I took another step back, looking down at her with pure disgust. "The money I earn protects soldiers on the front lines," I told her coldly, stepping around her trembling form. "The power I hold was earned through decades of grueling, relentless work, while you sat in this stolen mansion drinking wine and mocking my existence. My wealth is not a bailout fund for greedy accomplices. You enabled Julian's crimes because you loved the money he brought you. You turned a blind eye to the fraud because it funded your luxurious lifestyle. And now you are going to face the exact same consequences he does." Patricia collapsed entirely, burying her face in her hands and sobbing so violently her shoulders shook. Richard let out a low, agonizing moan, burying his face in his hands as the truth finally broke him. Julian did not even move. He just stared blankly at the wall, waiting for the end. And the end was already here. The heavy silence of the ruined living room was suddenly shattered by a sound that cut through the air like a knife. It started as a distant wail, carrying over the sprawling lawns of the wealthy neighborhood. Within seconds, the sound multiplied, growing louder and more deafening with every passing moment. It was the sharp, aggressive shriek of police sirens echoing directly from the long, winding driveway of the estate. My parents' heads snapped up, their eyes wide with fresh, blinding terror. The heavy mahogany front doors had been left ajar, and the terrifying noise poured into the grand foyer. Suddenly, the large bay windows of the living room were illuminated by harsh, frantic colors. Sweeping beams of flashing red and blue lights began to cut fiercely through the pristine room, washing over the expensive velvet sofas, the shattered crystal, and the heavy federal dossiers resting on the glass table. The reckoning had arrived. Before my parents could even process the flashing lights illuminating their ruin, the heavy mahogany front doors were violently breached. The deafening crash of a tactical battering ram splintered the expensive wood, sending sharp shards flying across the grand foyer. A swarm of FBI agents and federal marshals poured into the house like a relentless dark tide. They were clad in heavy tactical gear, Kevlar vests and helmets moving with a terrifying synchronized precision that immediately swallowed the remaining air in the room. Federal agents, get on the ground. Show me your hands. The harsh commands echoed off the vaulted ceilings, entirely shattering the suffocating silence of the estate. Julian, who had just been weeping pathetically at my feet, suddenly scrambled up. His survival instinct overriding his despair, he locked his panicked, bloodshot eyes on the massive glass patio doors leading to the back gardens. He bolted. The golden boy, the untouchable billionaire, abandoned his wife, his mother, and his father, making a desperate, frantic sprint for freedom. He slipped on the polished marble, his expensive leather shoes scrambling for traction as he threw his entire weight toward the glass. He did not even make it halfway across the room. Two heavily armored marshals intercepted him with ruthless efficiency. One of them lunged forward, catching Julian around the waist and driving him brutally into the marble floor. The impact was a sickening, heavy thud that knocked the breath out of him in a sharp wheeze. Julian gasped and thrashed his perfectly styled hair, now matted to his sweating forehead. But the marshal firmly planted a heavy tactical knee directly between his shoulder blades. The agent grabbed my brother's arms, twisting them painfully behind his back and securing his wrists with thick industrial zip ties. "You have the right to remain silent." The marshal barked completely, ignoring Julian's frantic, high-pitched squeals and pathetic begging. Patricia let out a blood-curdling shriek, pressing her hands over her ears, and curling into a trembling ball on the ruined rug. Richard remained absolutely paralyzed in his velvet armchair, his face a ghastly shade of gray, his mouth opening and closing in silent horror as he watched the tactical team secure every exit and sweep every room of his precious mansion. Their gilded empire was officially an active crime scene. Out of the sea of dark uniforms, a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped forward. He was the lead FBI agent, the one I had coordinated this entire operation with for the past 6 months. He bypassed the weeping women and the pinned golden child, walking deliberately toward the sitting area, where I still remained completely still, holding my delicate porcelain teacup. He stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me, squared his broad shoulders, and offered a sharp, deeply respectful salute. "Report, Director," he announced, his deep voice carrying clearly over the fading chaos of the room. "The perimeter is entirely secured. All exit routes are locked down and all primary warrants have been executed simultaneously across his corporate offices. We await your final orders." The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. "Director." The room went dead silent. Patricia slowly lowered her shaking hands from her tear-stained face, staring up at me with an expression of sheer, unadulterated terror. Richard gripped the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned white, his eyes darting frantically from the heavily armed tactical commander to his quiet, unassuming daughter in the tailored gray suit. The devastating realization finally washed over them in a suffocating, paralyzing wave. I was not a secretary. I was not a low-level bureaucrat pushing papers in a forgotten basement to be mocked at family dinners. I was the architect of this entire operation. I commanded the federal strike force that was currently dismantling their lives. The daughter they had discarded and laughed at was the absolute highest authority in the room, holding their entire existence in the palm of her hand. The heavy silence was suddenly broken by a desperate theatrical sob. Brooke, having witnessed the brutal physical takedown of her husband and the terrifying display of my authority, realized that her only chance of survival was to completely sever herself from the sinking ship. She scrambled to her feet, her designer clothes disheveled, her makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. She stumbled toward the closest federal agent, throwing her manicured hands up in a gesture of frantic surrender. "Please, you have to listen to me," Brooke cried out, her voice dripping with manufactured innocence and pathetic desperation. "I had absolutely nothing to do with this. I am just his wife. I did not know anything about his illegal business dealings, or his offshore accounts, or the money he was stealing. He lied to me, he cheated on me with some cheap real estate agent, and he hid everything from me. I am a victim here. You cannot hold me responsible for the crimes of a monster." The agent stared at her, his face a mask of absolute cold indifference. He glanced over his shoulder, looking directly at me for instruction. I slowly lowered my teacup, setting it gently on the silver tray. I did not say a word. I simply looked at Brooke's tear-streaked face and gave the agent a single curt nod. The agent turned his attention back to Brooke, reaching into a pouch on his tactical vest. He pulled out a folded piece of official paper and thrust it coldly into her trembling hands. "Brooke Vanguard," he stated, his voice completely devoid of a single ounce of sympathy. "I have a federal warrant here with your name on it. You are officially under arrest for the felony concealment of assets, wire fraud, and tax evasion." Brooke stared at the warrant as if it had physically burned her skin. The paper explicitly listed the offshore trust funds Julian had set up in her name, the millions of dollars she had knowingly funneled into her private accounts, and the fraudulent tax returns she had personally signed just 3 months ago. There was no pretending anymore. There was no plausible deniability. She was just as guilty as he was. "No!" she shrieked, dropping the paper and backing away in pure primal terror. "No, this is a mistake. Carmen, tell them it is a mistake. I am innocent. I am innocent." But the agent was already stepping forward, grabbing her wrists and pulling them firmly behind her back. The harsh metallic click of handcuffs echoed sharply through the room, sealing her fate just as securely as her husband's. The sound of the industrial tape being slapped across the heavy brass handles of the front doors was final. Each tearing noise echoed like a gunshot in the silent driveway. Agents moved with mechanical efficiency, ordering the disgraced family out of the property that was no longer theirs to occupy. Richard stood on the stone steps, his face twisted in a mask of impotent rage, his fingers trembling as he tried to argue with a stoic federal marshal. "The house was bought with money from the Ponzi scheme." The agent said, his voice flat and unyielding. "This asset is seized by the federal government under the authority of the Asset Forfeiture Act of 2026. You have exactly 3 minutes to vacate the premises." Patricia was a shell of the woman who had walked into the living room an hour before. Her expensive silk gown was wrinkled and stained from the marble floor, and her hair was coming undone in frantic disarray. She stood on the gravel driveway, shivering uncontrollably in the biting evening air. She was clutching nothing but a small designer clutch that the agents had cleared as having no evidentiary value. There were no suitcases, no bank cards, no keys to a secondary residence, and no secret stash of cash. She looked at the towering mansion that had served as her palace and saw only a cold, empty structure that would soon be locked away from her forever. Julian was still bound with zip ties, his face swollen from the impact of the tackle. The agents dragged him toward a transport van, his expensive Italian loafers scuffing uselessly against the pavement. He did not even look back at his parents or his wife. His entire focus was on the ground beneath his feet, as if he were trying to memorize the path to the vehicle that would take him to a federal holding facility. Brooke was sobbing in the back of a separate cruiser, her face pressed against the glass as she watched the life she had bought with Julian's stolen money vanish into the night. The chaos of the driveway began to settle as the agents finished the sweep. The mansion stood dark and imposing, the lights extinguished by the federal team, until the only illumination came from the flashing red and blue light bars mounted on the tops of the cruisers. I walked toward the sleek black armored SUV waiting at the end of the circular drive. My footsteps were steady and deliberate on the gravel path. I did not hurry. I did not look down. I moved with the absolute assurance of someone who had finally finished a chapter that had been tearing me apart for decades. An agent in a sharp charcoal suit held the heavy reinforced door of the vehicle open for me. He did not speak. He did not offer a congratulatory smile. He simply performed his duty, waiting for me to step into the sanctuary of the armored vehicle. As I prepared to climb inside, I heard a frantic, desperate wail rip through the cold air. "Carmen," she shrieked, the sound raw and broken. "Carmen, please, you cannot leave us here like this. Tell them to stop. Tell them to give us back our things." Patricia was running toward the SUV, her designer shoes stumbling on the uneven ground, her face a map of pure, terrified desperation. She reached out as if to grab the door handle, but an agent gently but firmly stepped between us. I paused for a fleeting second. I looked at the woman who had once told me that I was a mistake, that I was the reason for all her unhappiness, that I was destined to be a burden on her perfect life. I looked at the man standing behind her who had used his own children as pawns in his games of status and ego. They were shivering in the darkness, officially homeless, without a single resource to their names. They were finally looking at me not as a disappointment, but as the only person in the world who could possibly save them. I felt the cold metal of the door frame under my hand and looked at Patricia one final time. There was no malice in my expression, only a profound and hollow indifference. I reached out and gripped the edge of the door, pulling it closed with a smooth, controlled motion. The glass was dark and tinted, and as the window rolled up, I heard her voice fade into a thin, pathetic whimper. The armored engine roared to life. The driver shifted the vehicle into gear and we pulled away from the curb. I sat back in the plush leather seat and watched the scene play out in the rearview mirror. The mansion, the agents, the flashing lights, and the three broken figures shivering on the dark driveway grew smaller and smaller until they were nothing more than indistinct shadows against the black night. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out my tablet, checking the secure channel for the final briefing on the seized assets. Julian's Ponzi scheme was effectively dead. His offshore accounts were frozen, his shell companies were being liquidated, and the federal government was already preparing to return the stolen pensions to the victims he had betrayed. I took a deep breath, the air inside the vehicle feeling thin and clean. The long years of feeling the weight of their judgment and the constant fear of their disapproval were gone. The vehicle turned out of the estate gates, leaving the darkness behind. There was nothing left for me to do here. The law would handle the rest. As the city lights began to replace the desolate landscape of the suburbs, I allowed myself a single moment of quiet reflection. I had not wanted their suffering for the sake of it, but justice required a balance that had been tilted in their favor for far too long. Now the weight of their own greed had dragged them down exactly where they had tried to push me for so long. I locked the tablet and looked out at the passing streetlights, feeling a strange, quiet clarity. The case was closed, the family was dismantled, and for the first time in my life, I was finally completely alone and entirely free. The federal courtroom was stark and unyielding, its walls painted a clinical shade of beige that seemed to emphasize the absolute finality of the proceedings. 6 months of forensic accounting and grand jury testimony had distilled Julian's once sprawling empire of fraud down to this single room. I sat at the prosecution table, my back perfectly straight, my expression devoid of the warmth or empathy I had been forced to mimic in my own home for 3 decades. I was there not as a daughter, but as the director of a federal agency that had systematically dismantled the fraudulent life my brother had built on the backs of thousands of victims. The heavy oak doors groaned open, and the bailiff announced the entry of the prisoners. Julian walked in with his shoulders hunched, his head low. The designer suits and custom silk ties were gone, replaced by the abrasive orange of a standard federal jumpsuit that hung loosely on his gaunt frame. He had lost weight, and the arrogant glint that had always defined his eyes was replaced by a hollow shell of terror. He did not look like a billionaire. He looked like exactly what he had always been, a desperate man, drowning in his own lies. Brooke followed him, flanked by two bailiffs, her hands cuffed in front of her. She was a chaotic mess of frantic energy, her eyes scanning the gallery with wild panic. The moment she spotted Julian, she stopped dead and let out a vicious, guttural sound. "You bastard!" she screamed, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated hatred. "You sold me out! You pinned it all on me and my bank accounts! I hope they bury you in there!" She continued to spew obscenities until the bailiffs forced her into her seat, her face purple with rage. The judge, an elderly man with a reputation for absolute severity, walked in, and the entire gallery rose in silence. I felt a strange sense of detachment as the sentencing began. The judge reviewed the mountain of evidence, the forged deeds, the drained pension funds, the liquidated trusts, and the shell companies that had siphoned millions from unsuspecting investors. It was a catalog of greed that spanned years. "Julian Vance, I sentence you to 20 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole," the judge declared, his voice booming through the quiet courtroom. There was no mercy in his tone, only the weight of the law. Julian's knees buckled, and he had to be held upright by the guards, as his own lawyer patted his shoulder in a futile gesture of comfort. The golden boy was finally broken. "Brooke Vance." The judge continued, his gaze shifting to the woman sitting nearby. "Your role in the concealment of assets and your personal signature on falsified tax documents are well documented. I sentence you to 3 years in a federal facility, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. All assets connected to your name are permanently seized by the federal government and will be liquidated to provide restitution to the victims of this scheme." Brooke let out a sharp cry and collapsed forward onto the table, burying her face in her hands while her lawyers scrambled to quiet her. The gavel came down with a final sharp crack that signaled the end of their influence. As the court began to adjourn, I stood up and adjusted my blazer. I turned and walked toward the gallery where the public was being dismissed. My eyes searched the rows of spectators until they landed on 2 figures huddled in the back corner. My parents were unrecognizable. Richard was wearing a cheap nylon windbreaker that was clearly too large for his shrunken frame, and his hair was unkempt and gray. Patricia sat beside him in a faded, oversized cardigan, her skin papery and pale. They looked 10 years older than the people who had stood in the mansion foyer 6 months ago. They were no longer the masters of their own domain. They were broken remnants of a life that had been built on stolen time and fraudulent stability. As the room began to empty, they caught my gaze. The moment their eyes met mine, their entire demeanor changed from catatonic shock to desperate pleading. They scrambled up from the wooden bench, their movements clumsy and uncoordinated. They began to shuffle toward me, their expressions a mix of lingering arrogance and deep, profound desperation. They pushed through the thinning crowd, calling my name, their voices trembling and thin. "Carmen," they gasped. "Carmen, wait. We need to talk to you." The marshals moved to intercept them, but I held up a hand. I watched them approach, the distance between us closing slowly. They had no money, no home, and now they had no son left to protect their delusions. As they reached the edge of the aisle, they looked at me with eyes that were utterly hollow. They were officially homeless, officially ruined, and for the first time in my life, they were completely dependent on the very person they had once tried to destroy. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung shut with a finality that seemed to vibrate through the entire marble corridor. As I stepped out into the dim hallway, the sound of the public gallery dispersing behind me faded into a dull roar. I had expected to feel a surge of triumph, or perhaps a burning sense of vindication. But as I walked toward the exit, I felt nothing but a quiet, hollow space where a lifetime of resentment used to be. That silence was immediately shattered by the desperate shuffle of feet on the polished floor. Richard and Patricia emerged from the shadows near the elevators, their movements erratic and hesitant. They looked smaller than I remembered, almost fragile in their cheap, unwashed clothing. The fine wools and tailored silks of their former life had been replaced by thin, fraying layers that did little to hide the physical toll of their descent into poverty. Patricia reached out with a trembling hand, her fingers clawing at the air as she tried to bridge the distance between us. She looked like a ghost, a specter of the woman who had once wielded her status like a weapon to keep me in line. "Carmen, please," she rasped, the sound catching in her throat as she let out a jagged sob. "Please stop just for 1 minute. We have been living in the complex on the east side for 3 months now, and the conditions are unbearable. There is no heat at night and the walls are paper thin. We are begging you. We are not asking for the mansion back or the cars or the life we had. We just need a small monthly allowance to get by to move somewhere safe." She stepped closer, her eyes wide and wet with a terrifying kind of hope. "We are your parents, Carmen. You are our only child left. Julian is gone and you have everything. Surely you have enough mercy to help us survive." I stopped walking and turned slowly to face them. Richard stood a few feet behind her, his head bowed, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a coat that was clearly second-hand. He did not look up, but the way his shoulders shook told me everything I needed to know about his state of mind. He was waiting for her to break me. He was waiting for the moment I would revert to the compliant daughter who prioritized their comfort over my own survival. I looked at Patricia, the woman who had looked at me with disdain for every year of my existence. I looked at the lines of exhaustion carved into her face and the frantic desperation in her eyes. 6 months ago, this moment would have terrified me. It would have made me feel the crushing weight of their expectations and the lingering fear of their disapproval. But standing there in the cold, sterile light of the courthouse, all I felt was a profound sense of distance. They were not my parents in any way that mattered. They were simply two people who had spent their lives profiting from my exploitation, and who were now terrified that the mirror I held up to them had finally shattered. "The law does not require me to financially support people who signed legal documents disowning me 10 years ago," I said, my voice clear and steady, echoing against the marble. I saw Patricia recoil as if I had struck her. Her mouth opened in a silent protest, and she clutched at her chest. I continued looking, not with hatred or bitterness, but with the chilling indifference of a person who has already mourned their existence. "I have fulfilled my obligations to the state. I have ensured that the victims of the Ponzi scheme have received every cent of restitution possible. My responsibility to this family ended the moment you decided I was a waste of resources." I saw Richard finally look up. His eyes were hollowed out like a dry riverbed, and there was a flicker of realization in them that he had truly lost everything. He opened his mouth to speak, his voice a broken, gravelly whisper. "We made mistakes, Carmen. We were wrong. But we did not think it would end like this. We did not think we would end up in a slum." I did not blink. I did not let my gaze soften for a single second. The reality of their situation was not a tragedy that I had inflicted upon them, but a consequence they had meticulously crafted for themselves. Their pride had been their compass, and it had led them exactly where it always intended to go. I shook my head once slowly. "You are living exactly the life you designed for yourselves when you chose to enable Julian's crimes for the sake of your own vanity. Your situation is not a mistake, Richard. It is an outcome. Good luck." Without waiting for a retort, I turned on my heel. The transition from the chaotic, emotional plea to the simple act of walking away was the easiest thing I had ever done. The rhythmic clicking of my heels against the marble floor sounded sharp and authoritative, a metronome marking the final seconds of my connection to them. I did not check the rearview mirror. I did not look back to see if they were still standing there, or if they had finally collapsed in the cold hallway. The past was not a place I was ever going to visit again. As I pushed through the heavy glass doors into the bright afternoon sunlight, I felt the air change. It was crisp and biting, but it felt clean. The city before me was vibrant and busy, a world of millions of people who had no idea who I was or what I had just left behind. I walked past the parked taxis and the bustling pedestrians, my posture straight, my breathing even. Every step took me further away from the mansion, from the accusations, from the desperate begging, and from the toxic legacy that had defined my youth. The armored SUV was idling at the curb, its engine humming a low, reassuring sound. The driver held the door open for me, and as I slid into the back seat, I felt the lock click into place. It was not a cage. It was a boundary. For the first time in 30 years, there was no one in my house who could demand my attention. There was no one in my life who could rewrite my narrative. There was only the future and the silence of a life finally lived on my own terms. I checked my phone one last time, seeing a dozen notifications from the agency about the next phase of the asset recovery. I swiped them away one by one. The case was closed, and the history books were already being written without them. I closed my eyes and let the car glide into the flow of traffic, leaving the shadows of the courthouse to dissolve into the bright, relentless glare of the day. My heart beat with a steady, rhythmic calm, a sound of perfect alignment and profound relief. The weight was finally gone. I was not a daughter. I was not a victim. I was simply Carmen, and for the first time in my life, that was more than enough. The polished brass plaque on my office door at the Pentagon finally read, Director of Asset Recovery and Financial Oversight. It was a weight that had once seemed impossible to bear, but now it felt like a natural extension of my own resolve. 6 months of relentless investigations and precise strategic maneuvers had brought me to this vantage point, where I stood as the architect of my own professional salvation. I had become the person everyone said I was not capable of being. I was not the bitter woman seeking a petty payout. I was the architect of a new system that prioritized accountability over bloodlines and integrity over influence. My colleagues and subordinates moved with a new level of respect around me, no longer seeing the shadows of the disgraced family name that had once trailed behind me. I was Carmen Vance, and my reputation was finally built on the solid ground of my own achievements. The dinner party at my penthouse was the final piece of a puzzle I had been constructing for years. The space was bathed in the warm, golden glow of recessed lighting, the floor-to-ceiling windows, framing the sprawling expanse of the city skyline below. I stood at the head of a mahogany table that was set for 12. The atmosphere was not the stifling and performative display of my parents' mansion. Here, there was laughter that started deep in the chest and flowed freely between friends who actually knew the price I had paid to arrive at this moment. My guests were a tapestry of the people who had stood by me when I had nothing but a suitcase and a singular burning resolve. There was the federal marshal who had kept my back turned toward the mansion when I walked away for the last time. There was the paralegal who had stayed late night after night sifting through boxes of Julian's falsified tax records. And there was my dear friend Sarah, the only person who had not once questioned my sanity when I told her I was going to take down a billionaire with nothing but a tablet and a decade of suppressed evidence. We clinked our glasses together, and the sound was crisp and resonant. This was my chosen family. These were the people who had seen the worst of my trauma and had helped me build this life. The evening was nearing its close when my assistant tapped gently on the doorframe. She looked hesitant, clutching a heavy white envelope in her hands. She walked over to the side table where I had set down my wine glass. "Director," she said softly. "This arrived in the afternoon courier." She placed it on the velvet runner. It had a distinct, coarse texture and the unmistakable stamp of a federal correctional facility. Julian had finally written. I did not need to see the return address to know who it was from. The jagged handwriting that slanted violently across the paper was unmistakable. I picked it up for a fleeting second, feeling the slight weight of the paper that contained the first attempt at contact from the man who had stolen my inheritance and tried to crush my soul. I knew what was inside. He would be begging for forgiveness. He would be claiming that he had been misguided. He would be asking for a favor for a small injection of funds into his commissary account so he could buy the thin comforts of prison life. He would be trying to leverage our childhood to see if I had any softness left in my heart. I looked at the paper for a moment, feeling nothing. The anger that had driven me through the depositions, the court hearings, and the seizures of their assets had long since evaporated. There was no satisfaction in his plea. There was no pity, either. There was only the absolute clarity of a chapter that had already been closed. I did not break the seal. I did not read a single word of his justifications. I walked toward the corner of the room where the office equipment was kept. I fed the envelope into the mouth of the cross-cut shredder. The machine whirred to life, its blades hungrily pulling the paper in and turning his apologies into a fine gray dust that cascaded into the bin below. I went back to the table and picked up my wineglass. The conversation had moved on to a future project, an initiative to overhaul how federal agencies tracked shell companies and money laundering. I listened to my team debate the merits of the new software, feeling a profound sense of lightness. The past was a ghost that could no longer haunt me. I was not waiting for an apology. I was not waiting for them to finally understand what they had done. I was simply living. As I looked around the table at the faces of my friends, I saw a reflection of my own resilience. We were all people who had faced betrayal and had chosen to construct something better. The house was quiet now, except for the murmur of voices and the distant hum of the city. I moved to the balcony and stepped out into the night air. The breeze was cool and smelled of rain and promise. I leaned against the cold railing and looked out at the lights. For the first time in 30 years, there was no one in my life I had to fear. There was no one I had to impress. There was only the work I loved, the people I had gathered around me, and the certainty that I was exactly where I belonged. The silence of the night was not lonely. It was rich with the potential of a tomorrow that was entirely my own. The battle was won, and the victory was not in the destruction of the old life, but in the quiet peace of the new one. I took a final sip of my wine and stepped back inside, ready to start the next day without looking back. The sun would rise soon, and it would be the first day of the rest of my life. I reached out and dimmed the lights, leaving the room in a gentle shadow. Everything was finally exactly as it should be. The Virginia sun was generous that afternoon, bathing the sprawling lawn of the estate in a warm, golden light that felt like a benediction. I sat on a cushioned patio chair watching the sunlight dance across the surface of the infinity pool, while the air filled with the scent of hickory smoke and blooming magnolias. The estate was a testament to a life rebuilt from the ruins of a systemic fraud. Here the silence was not the oppressive emptiness I had grown up with, but a vibrant, peaceful hum of contentment. In my arms, my newborn daughter nestled against my chest, her tiny fingers curled around my thumb. She was the embodiment of a new lineage, one that would never be shaped by the cold calculations of status or the desperate cruelty of greed. Beside me stood Marcus, his hand resting gently on my shoulder with a strength that grounded me. He was a man who had built his own success through grit and intellectual rigor, and his presence was a constant reminder that I had finally found the partnership I had been denied for so long. His family occupied the lawn, a boisterous and welcoming group of aunts, cousins, and friends who treated me not as a trophy or a pawn, but as a sister and a friend. They were the people who had brought dishes to my table when I had been broke, and who had held me as I wept over the wreckage of my parents' betrayal. They were my chosen roots, and in their presence I felt a sense of belonging that was both deep and absolute. My mind drifted briefly to the people who had once been the center of my world, and who were now fading into the periphery of a dark and distant memory. Julian was serving his second year in a maximum security facility, a place where his silver tongue and connections meant nothing against the crushing monotony of iron bars. His reality was now defined by the count and the concrete, and I knew that the letters he sent to my office were merely echoes of a man who realized too late that he had traded his humanity for a temporary seat at the table. Brooke had been released a few months prior, but the life she had once flaunted was gone. She was now just another face behind the grease fryers of a dingy highway fast food joint, a place where the air smelled of stale oil and failed ambition. My parents remained in that cramped unit on the edge of the city. I heard through the grapevine that Richard spent his days staring at the peeling wallpaper of their subsidized flat, while Patricia sat in the corner of their shared room, nursing the agonizing bitterness of her own choices. They had sacrificed their daughter for a life of performative luxury, and in the end, they had lost the luxury, the daughter and the very pride they had sought to protect. There was no malice left in me for them, only a flat, hollow pity for the fact that they had chosen to spend their twilight years in the cage of their own regret. They had been the authors of their own undoing, and I was no longer a character in their tragic script. I looked down at my daughter, watching her eyelids flutter as she drifted into a dreamless sleep. Marcus leaned down and brushed a kiss across her forehead, his smile a soft reflection of the love that now defined my existence. He looked at me with eyes that saw the woman I was, rather than the role I had been assigned. He was the partner who had taught me that home was not a mansion filled with secrets, but a space where truth and kindness could thrive. His family laughed loudly at a story near the pool, inviting me to join them without a second thought of status or obligation. I watched them and realized that I had successfully severed the roots of the toxic tree that had once tried to starve me of light. The generational curse of the Vance family ended with me. I had dismantled the corruption, I had turned the legal system against the perpetrators, and I had walked away from the wreckage without needing a single crumb from their table. My daughter would grow up knowing that her worth was inherent and that her value was not linked to a ledger or a reputation. She would never have to calculate her value against the siblings she was competing with or the parents who viewed her as a liability. I picked up my glass of sweet iced tea and took a slow sip, the condensation cold against my palm. The ice clinked softly against the glass, a pleasant sound in the quiet afternoon. I looked out over the lush landscape of my own making and felt the last vestiges of the old tension leave my shoulders. They always say that blood is thicker than water, but I know the truth now. Peace of mind is thicker than both. I had shattered the cycle of performative perfection and cold indifference that had defined my youth. My children will never know what it feels like to beg for a seat at the table because we built a table of our own. I smiled at the expanse of my life, finally whole and finally free, and waited for the next gentle breeze to carry the memory of the past away. The most valuable lesson from this story is that true worth is never defined by the conditional approval of those who failed to value you. While betrayal and neglect are deeply painful, they ultimately provide the clarity needed to break toxic cycles and build a life of genuine integrity. You do not need to seek validation from people who spent years trying to make you feel invisible. Instead, use that adversity as the foundation for your own independence. Success, when built on your own terms, is the most powerful form of justice. If you have ever had to walk away from a family that didn't deserve you, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of resilience and reclaiming your power.